The morning after the county crew left, Delden Marsh walked the perimeter of what had been his seed plot before the sun was fully above the tree line, 2 acres. The burn line was clean on the western edge, where the crew had used a disc to stop the fire from jumping the fence row, but ragged on the east where the wind had taken it a little farther than anyone had planned. The soil was still warm in patches. He could feel it through the soles of his work boots when he stopped walking and stood still. He did not say anything to the field. He was not that kind of man. What he did was crouch down and press 2 fingers into the ash at the center of the burned strip and hold them there until he had a sense of what the ground was doing underneath. It was October, and the frost had come once already, and the soil was giving off a faint mineral heat that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with chemistry. The potash releasing into the top inch, the carbon fixing into the surface layer, the whole upper profile of the ground in a state of adjustment that, if Delden had wanted to make the argument, was not entirely without value. He did not make the argument. He stood up and put his hands in the pockets of his canvas coat and looked at the black strip for another minute, then turned and walked back to the barn. Inside, on the high shelf above the fuel cans, was a canvas seed pouch, about the size of a man's clenched fist. He had moved it there 2 weeks before the county order arrived, when Fay Kinzer at the extension office had called him on a Wednesday afternoon and said that someone had filed a complaint, and he should know that the compliance officer was going to come out. He had thanked her and hung up and gone directly to the barn and moved the pouch from the shed to the high shelf, where it sat now behind a rusted coffee tin and an old jar of petroleum jelly, with the label gone. The pouch still smelled faintly of smoke from the field, which made no sense given the distance, but Delden had been smelling things that were not quite there for 48 hours, and he did not think too carefully about that. The pouch held approximately 400 seeds, pre-hired grain, sorghum, what the state extension catalog in 1949 had called BTX 623 parent line, and what Over Pruitt had called simply the old grain. She had kept it alive on 11 acres of creek-bottom ground a quarter-mile up the road for 37 years before her death in 1983, selecting the strongest heads each fall by hand, drying them on a screen in her back room, recording in a hand-ruled ledger every yield, every germination rate, every weather anomaly she had observed across those seasons. When she died, she left the ledger and the seed pouch to Delden Marsh, who was 44 years old, who had been her neighbor for 20 years and her student for the last 7 of them, and who was now the only person in Harmon County who understood what either the pouch or the ledger contained. He climbed on a feed bucket and took the pouch down from the shelf and held it in both hands and thought about what 400 seeds could do if he was careful. Then he put it back and went inside for breakfast. His wife, Nora, had the radio on the compliance office. Report would be filed within 30 days, the extension coordinator had said on his way out the afternoon before. There would be a summary letter. It was procedure. Delden had thanked him too. The seed had been called a problem before Delden ever got involved with it. Over Pruitt had grown up on that quarter-mile of creek-bottom ground and had inherited the sorghum strain from her own father, who had gotten it as a cutting from a government experimental station in 1944 as part of a drought-resistant study that was later defunded. Her father had seen what the strain did in the dry year and had simply kept it going, the way you keep a thing going when you understand that losing it would be stupid. Over had continued after him with more rigor than he had applied. She was a woman who believed in writing things down, in measuring what she had, in not trusting her memory for something that mattered. In 1971, she had gone to the Harmon County Extension meeting in April to explain what she had and to ask whether any of the soil scientists from Oklahoma State might be interested in the germplasm. The county extension agent at the time, a man named Doss Witten, had let her finish and then told the room that what Mrs. Pruitt had was a relic variety, that relic varieties were sentimental by nature and impractical by performance, and that the county's direction was toward higher-yield hybrids that could sustain the mechanized operations the future required. He said this without reading the ledger she had placed on the table in front of him. He said it to the room in the way that a man says something when he has already decided the case and is performing the decision for an audience. Ova had picked up her ledger, folded her hands and said, "All right," and driven home. She had told Delden about the meeting 4 years later on a Saturday morning when he had come to help her move a downed fence post. It was not a story she told with bitterness. She told it the way she told most things, as a record of what had actually occurred without ornament, she said. Dos Whitten has never sat in a dry August and watched his sorghum go to tassel fire while the creek-bottom grain next door was still making heads. When he does, he can tell me what's sentimental. Delden had been 36 years old that Saturday. He had a working operation of 160 acres that split between the rich creek-bottom ground on the south end and the tight moisture-resistant red clay on the north. And he ran mostly commercial hybrid sorghum that the co-op recommended and the elevator would buy without argument. He was not a man looking to complicate his operation. But Ova Pruitt could make a case. She had the ledger to support it. And he had walked back to her seed plot that day, after the fence post was reset, and put his hands in the soil, and felt the difference between what she had built and what he had always assumed was normal, and the difference was real enough to get inside him and stay. He did not change his operation that fall, or the next. He watched her work and asked questions on Saturday mornings, and let the information accumulate the way good soil accumulates, slowly, in the dark, without announcement. The co-op meeting in spring of 1986 was where the problem went public. Someone. It later turned out to be two separate someones. One of them a new hire at the county compliance office who had misread a federal advisory bulletin, had raised the question of relic variety seed plots as potential disease vectors. The concern had some legitimate basis in a different context entirely, involving a different crop in a different state. But it had traveled into Harmon County like all bad information travels, laundered through one telephone call and presented as established fact. The compliance office had put together an advisory memo. The co-op had discussed it. And Clive Rutter, who ran a 1,200-acre operation on the north side of the county road from Delden Marsh, and who sat on the Agricultural Advisory Board, had told the room at the co-op that he had been worried about Delden Marsh's old neighbor's seed plot for years, and that frankly the new operator of that ground, meaning Delden, who had taken on the creek bottom 11 acres after Ova's estate was settled, was going to poison the whole county with the weed seed his old neighbor left him in a coffee can. He said this in front of 22 people, including the county extension coordinator, the elevator manager, and the younger son of the man who owned Delden's notes at the First National. Delden was not in the room. He heard the account second-hand from his neighbor on the other side, a quiet man named Bert Sims who had been there and felt bad about it. That night, Delden sat at the kitchen table with Ova Pruitt's ledger open to the first page and read her notes from the first season she had managed the plot alone, 1948, a year that the state climatological record described as normal, but that she described as a year with 2 dry intervals in July that would have hurt an unprotected crop badly. Her yield that year had been 36 bushels to the acre on 11 acres of creek-bottom ground. The county average for sorghum that year, which Delden had looked up in the state agricultural bulletin 3 years before, was 21 bushels to the acre. He closed the ledger and put it back on the shelf above the kitchen door and went to bed. The complaint was filed in August 1985, by the compliance office acting on the advisory memo. The enforcement order came in September. The burn crew arrived in October. After the burn, Delden went on working. This was not a remarkable decision in the way that people who did not farm tended to think remarkable decisions were made. It was not a moment of standing at a crossroads with a fixed expression while the wind moved dramatically through a field. It was simply that the 400 seeds were on the high shelf in the barn, and the ledger was in the house. And it was November, and there were 148 acres of stubble that needed disking before the first hard freeze, and so he went to work on the stubble. He ran the disc through the burned strip on the second pass. The ash worked into the soil the way he had thought it would, and the 2-acre strip that had been Ova's heritage plot came out of November with a soil profile that was, if anything, more prepared for spring than it had been going in. He did not make that argument to anyone. He wrote it down in the back of the ledger, in his own hand, in the margin below Over's final entry. Winter was quiet. Nora's mother came to stay for 6 weeks in January, and the three of them ate dinner together every night, and the topic of the burned field came up exactly twice. Once when the summary letter arrived from the county compliance office, and once when Clive Rutter called in February to say he hoped there were no hard feelings. Delden told him there were no hard feelings. That was accurate. What Delden had was not hard feelings. What he had was a canvas seed pouch and a ledger and an understanding of what the spring soil conditions in that particular 2-acre strip were going to be. And none of that had anything to do with feelings of any kind. He replanted the heritage sorghum in May of 1986. He did not announce this. He did not apply for a variance or request a review of the enforcement order, though Fay Kinzer had told him when he stopped by the extension office to pick up a soil test kit that spring, that the complaint that had triggered the order was based on a misidentified variety, and that if he had documentation of the variety's original registration, he might have standing to request a review. He had thanked her and picked up the test kit and gone home. He had the documentation. He had the 1949 state registration papers in the back of Over's ledger, filed behind the last season's yield notes where she had put them 20 years before, knowing that someone might need them eventually. He did not file for review. He planted the seeds. The first year back, he got 60% germination from the 400-seed pouch and harvested enough good heads in September to fill a new pouch 3 times over. He dried the seed on a screen in the back room the way Over had done. He recorded the germination rate, the plant height, the head weight, and the date of the first hard frost in the ledger. He was back. The second year, he planted the full 2 acres and the strip came in at 32 bushels to the acre, which was below Over's creek bottom average but above what the soil conditions warranted, given that the burn had altered the top layer in ways that would need another 2 or 3 seasons to fully settle. He wrote that in the ledger too. He was patient, in the way that a person is patient when they are not waiting for something to happen, but are instead tracking something that is already happening and requires attention. Clive Rutter, running 1,200 acres of commercial hybrid sorghum across the county road, was seeing his input costs rise at a rate that the elevator price was not matching. The co-op had pushed a new fertilizer program that required heavier application to get the yields the hybrid varieties needed. Diesel was up. Equipment was up. Rutter had taken on a second operating loan in the spring of 1987 to cover the shortfall, and a third in early 1988. Delden knew this the way that neighbors in a small county know things about each other, not from conversation, but from the observable evidence of machinery moving at certain hours, of trucks parked at certain banks, of conversations that stopped when one person entered a room at the co-op. In the spring of 1988, Delden opened Over Pruitt's ledger to the entry for 1956 and read it slowly. The entry ran 4 pages in her careful handwriting and covered a single season in more detail than any other year in the book. 1956 had been a drought year, a real one, not a dry interval, but a protracted failure of rain from the second week of June through the third week of August. Over had documented the creek bottom soil's moisture retention week by week, comparing it to what she could see across the fence line on her neighbor's ground, where the soil was similar, but the crop was commercial hybrid. By mid-July, the neighbor's sorghum was in thermal stress and aborting grain. Over's heritage plot, drawing on root architecture that the hybrid lines had traded away for early yield, was pulling moisture from 14 inches down and still making heads. Her yield that year was 29 bushels to the acre. Her neighbor came in at 7. She had ended the 1956 entry with one sentence in a slightly darker ink, as if she had come back later to add it. The old grain knows how to be thirsty. Delden closed the ledger on that sentence and looked out the kitchen window at the sky above the south field. It was April, and the sky looked the way a dry sky begins to look before the people watching it have admitted to themselves that it is a dry sky. A particular pale blue that had too much of something in it that was not moisture. He had been watching the almanac and the soil temperature charts and the patterns in the creek level that he checked every morning on his way to the barn. And everything he was reading told him that the summer coming was going to be dry in a way that was either bad or historic, depending on where you stood when it arrived. He had 2 acres of heritage sorghum in the ground. He had the ledger. He had Owa Pruitt's exact sentence in her own hand, written in darker ink, as if she had known someone would need to read it 32 years later and had wanted to be sure the weight of it came through. He drove to the feed store that afternoon and bought 3 more 50-pound bags of gypsum, which he did not need for any purpose he was willing to explain to anyone, and drove home. To June of 1988 gave Harmon County 11 days of measurable rainfall, and then it stopped. It stopped the way things stop, in a drought, not with drama, but with absence. The sky remained that pale, too clear blue, and the temperature climbed and the creek dropped by 4 inches in the first week of July, which was the fastest drop Delden had ever recorded in 15 years of checking it every morning. He had a coffee can buried in the creek bank at the measurement point with a painted inch scale on the inside. A system Owa Pruitt had taught him, and he wrote the number in a separate log he kept on the kitchen counter. The 7th of July, 4 inches low. The 14th of July, 7 inches low. The 21st of July, 10 inches low. And the air temperature at 6 in the morning was 91 degrees, which was a temperature he had never recorded at 6 in the morning before. Across the county road, Clive Rutter's 1,200 acres of hybrid sorghum went into thermal stress in the 2nd week of July. Delden could see it from the north fence line of his property, the plants shortening as they redirected energy away from grain production, the heads going sparse, the flag leaves curling along their edges in a way that meant the cellular damage was already done and the plant was in triage. He did not say anything about it when he saw it. He turned around and walked back to the south end of his property where the 2-acre heritage strip was running. The heritage sorghum was thirsty. There was no other word for it. The plants were showing stress at the leaf margins and the root zones were pulling hard against the dry soil. But it was working. The heads were still filling. The root architecture that Owa had described in 1956, the deep lateral network that the hybrid breeders had considered irrelevant in a year of normal rainfall, was reaching down through 14, 16, 18 inches of dry creek bottom clay and finding water that the hybrid's roots had never been long enough to reach. Delden walked the strip 3 mornings a week and measured and wrote the numbers down. By the 1st of August, the county extension office had begun informal conversations about drought assistance applications. The co-op manager, a man named Terrace Webb, had called 2 emergency meetings about the price situation and the loan situation, and had stopped using the word catastrophic in public while using it extensively in private. The consolidated yield forecast for Harmon County sorghum was revised downward twice in 30 days. The heritage strip on Delden Marsh's creek bottom kept filling heads. In the 3rd week of August, a soil scientist from Oklahoma State named Dr. Anita Perryman drove out to the county at the request of the state agricultural office, which was doing a drought impact assessment. She had a specific interest in what she called differential stress response, the observable difference in performance between crop varieties under the same drought conditions on adjacent or similar soil. She had heard about the marsh operation from Faye Kinzer at the Extension Office, who had made the call not as a professional act, but as the act of a woman who had been watching the county's agricultural records for 22 years and knew when something was worth a scientist's drive. Dr. Perryman spent 2 hours on Delden's property on a Tuesday afternoon in August, walking both sides of the creek bottom with a probe and a notebook. She took soil samples from 8 locations. She measured root depth on 3 representative plants in the heritage strip. She looked across the fence line at Clive Rutter's adjacent field for a long time without saying anything. Then she turned to Delden and said, "Is this the same soil type on both sides of the fence line?" He told her it was. She wrote in her notebook for 2 more minutes. Then she said, "Where did you get this variety?" He told her about Over Pruitt. He told her about the ledger. He offered to get it from the house, and she said, "Yes, please." And he got it, and she read the 1956 entry, standing up in the field with the sun on her back and the dry air moving through the sorghum heads around her. When she was finished, she looked up and said, "She documented this in 1956, and nobody in the Extension Service followed it," he said. "She tried in 1971, Doctor." Perryman looked at the field for a moment longer and then handed the ledger back carefully with both hands. The gin ran in October. Every operation in Harmon County brought their loads in through the same facility on the east side of town, which meant that the weights and the averages were public knowledge in the particular way that facts are public when they are posted on a board in a room where people come every day. Deldon's heritage strip came in at 41 bushels to the acre on 2 acres of creek-bottom ground in the worst drought since 1936. He had held the grain back deliberately until the end of the run, not for effect, but because he wanted the soil moisture to finish what it was doing before he cut the heads. The number went on the board on a Tuesday afternoon with Terrace Webb at the counter and 3 other operators in the room who had been watching the board all week and knew what they were looking at. The county average for the season was 8 bushels to the acre. Terrace Webb looked at the board for a moment without speaking, and then looked at Deldon and said, "Is that 2 acres?" Deldon said it was. Webb looked at the board again. He did not say anything else. He wrote the number in the log. One of the other operators in the room, a man named Arvil Greer, who ran 400 acres on the west side of the county and who had been at the co-op meeting in 1986 where the term weed seed had been applied to Deldon's heritage grain, looked at the board for a long time and then walked outside without a word. Clive Rutter's truck came up Deldon's driveway at dusk on a Thursday in October, moving slowly on the gravel the way a truck moves when the person driving it is not sure whether to keep going or turn around. Deldon was on the porch, having his evening coffee when it came. He watched it come up the full length of the drive and park at the edge of the yard, and he watched Rutter get out and leave his hat on the seat, which was a thing a person does when they are not sure what to do with their hands, and he watched him walk across the yard and stop at the porch steps. Rutter was a big man with a sun-darkened neck and the particular posture of someone who had spent decades behind steering wheels and equipment controls. And on that October evening, he looked smaller than his build. He stood at the bottom of the steps and said, "I heard what you got at the gin." Deldon said he had. Rutter looked at the yard for a moment and then said, "I was wrong about what I said at the meeting. The thing I said about the coffee can, Deldon said he knew." There was a silence between them that was not hostile but was specific. 2 men standing in the particular kind of quiet that comes after a long, loud error has been named by the person who made it. Then Deldon said, "You want to see the ledger?" Rutter looked up at him. Deldon said, "It explains what the seed does in a dry year. There's 40 years of documentation. If you want to know what I was working with, it's all in there." Rutter was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Yeah, I'd like to see that." Deldon went inside and got the ledger and brought it out and sat down on the top step, and Rutter sat on the second step, and they went through the 1956 entry and the 1961 entry and the drought notes from 1974 together in the last of the daylight, Deldon reading aloud the yield numbers and the years that mattered, and Rutter listening without saying much. After a while, Rutter asked whether Deldon had more seed than the 2-acre plot could generate, and Deldon said he did not yet, but would, by next year, if the stand came back clean. Rutter asked whether he might be able to get a small allocation to trial on a few acres in the spring. Deldon said he thought that could be arranged. They did not shake hands. They sat on the steps together until the light was fully gone, and then Rutter got up and said he appreciated it, and walked back to his truck and drove out the way he had come in slowly on the gravel. Deldon sat on the top step for a few more minutes with the ledger in his lap and thought about Over Pruitt who had driven away from the 1971 extension meeting without bitterness and come home to plant the same seeds the following spring, which was the only answer she had ever believed in. Then he went inside. Dr. Perryman's assessment came back to the county extension office in a published bulletin in January of 1989. The bulletin covered 12 drought-resilient crop varieties observed during the 1988 season across southwestern Oklahoma, and it included a 2-page section on the heritage grain sorghum grown on a creek bottom operation in Harmon County that had produced, in the assessment's language, anomalous yield performance under conditions of extreme drought stress. Yield performance that the bulletin attributed to exceptional root architecture and soil organic matter content, both measurable and both documented across multiple decades in unpublished field data. The bulletin described the organic matter content of the creek bottom soil in Delden's heritage strip as exceptional. That was the word Dr. Perryman had used in conversation and that she had carried into the formal document. The county average for organic matter in comparable soil type was 1.8%. Delden's strip tested at 4.3%. The difference represented 37 years of Pruitt's management, her refusal to use synthetic fertilizer in the heritage plot, her practice of returning every spent stalk to the soil, her earthworm counts recorded in the ledger going back to 1951 that Delden had converted to pounds per cubic foot. Perryman's methodology. The county compliance office sent no response to the bulletin. The enforcement order remained on the administrative record. Neither of these facts troubled Delden Marsh. What happened in the spring of 1989 was this. Faye Kinzer called from the extension office on a Tuesday morning and told Delden that she had found the original 1949 state registration papers for the BTX 623 parent line in the State Agricultural Archive, cross-referenced against the variety name Pruitt had used in her first ledger entry. The variety had never appeared on any disease vector list in any year. The complaint that had triggered the 1985 enforcement order had misidentified the variety by a similar catalog number. The misidentification was in the original compliance file. Faye had found it in 15 minutes once she knew what she was looking for. She said, "I'm sorry we didn't catch this before the burn. I should have looked harder in 1985. Delden said, "You called me ahead of it. That was what mattered." There was a short silence, and then Faye said, "I knew Ova. She used to bring vegetables by the office in the summer." Delden said he knew. He did not file a complaint against the county compliance office. He did not request restitution. He had the seed, which was the only part of the story that had ever been at risk. And he had the ledger, and he had the soil, which after 4 years of recovery had an organic matter content that the state's own bulletin had called exceptional. He did not need anything else from the county. What he needed was in the barn. The spring that Rue Marsh turned 9 years old, her grandfather walked her through the heritage strip on a Saturday morning in March, when the soil was just warm enough to work. She was small for her age and wore one of Nora's old canvas barn coats that came to her knees, and she had her grandfather's habit of walking with her hands in her pockets when she was thinking. Delden stopped at the edge of the 2 acres and said, "Put your hands in the dirt here." She pulled her hands out of her pockets and crouched down and pressed them into the surface of the soil, the way he had shown her before, not patting, but pressing, feeling what the ground was doing. She said, "It's warmer than the path." He said, "What else?" She thought about it. Then she said, "It feels loose, like it gives when you push." He said, "That's the organic matter. That's what 39 years of the right management feels like. You hold that in your head. That's what you're aiming for." She stood up and rubbed the soil off her hands onto the knee of her jeans and looked at the 2 acres laid out before them in the pale March light. The ground had a deep reddish-brown color in the top inch that was different from the color of the field on either side of it, and she had noticed the difference the first time her grandfather had brought her out to this end of the property 2 years before. She had never asked him why it was different. She was the kind of child who stored questions until she understood enough to ask them correctly. She said, "Grandpa, can I hold the seeds?" He had the ledger in one hand and the canvas seed pouch in the other, because they always came out together the way they had since Ova Pruitt had kept them together on a shelf in her back room for 3 decades. He handed Rue the pouch. She held it in both hands and felt the weight of it, approximately 400 seeds. The current generation descended from the stock that Ova's father had brought back from a government experimental station in 1944. The stock that had survived a county extension dismissal in 1971 and a compliance burn in 1985 and a drought in 1988 without any of those events having diminished it in any measurable way. Rue held the weight of that in both hands and did not know all of what it was yet, but she was 9 years old and standing in the soil that contained 39 years of careful work. And her hands were reading the pouch the same way they had just read the ground, and the learning was going in. Deldin opened the ledger to the first page. Ova's handwriting, neat and considered, dated March 1948, the first entry she had made as sole keeper of the seed. He said, she wrote everything down. Every season, every yield, every time it rained and every time it didn't. She kept this so the next person would know what they had. Rue looked up at him. She said, "The next person was you?" He said, "For a while." She looked back at the field. The March air was still cold, but the soil under their feet was warm, the warmth coming from below, from the deep organic activity in the creek bottom layer that Ova Pruitt had built and Deldin Marsh had maintained, and that was still doing its work regardless of what any administrative record said about the years between. Rue transferred the seed pouch to one hand and reached out and took the corner of the ledger with her other hand, not taking it, just holding the same corner her grandfather held, the two of them standing at the edge of the 2 acres, together with the morning coming on. The seeds were still viable. The ledger still had empty pages in the back. The creek still ran, below the tree line of the south end of the property, audible in the March quiet, a low, steady sound that had been running through every season this ground had known, through the dry Julies and the wet Aprils, and the years when the county's opinion of what was worth keeping had turned out to be wrong. The stone in the creek bed did not keep a record of any of it. The soil did, and the soil was still there, and it was exceptional, and it was ready for spring. Is there something you were told to let go of? A method, an idea, a knowledge that someone passed to you, that the ground hasn't finished proving yet?